And now I have the great pleasure to welcome Julian Bell to the Metropolitan Museum. He's flown in from London, as I mentioned, for this occasion. Oxford-educated, Mr. Bell is a practicing painter, art critic, and writer whose reviews and essays range broadly. Rembrandt, Chardin, Monet, Salman Rushdie, Ernst Gombrich, Monet, Mondrian, Francis Bacon, and indeed Bonnard are but a few of his subjects in a rich anthology of publications. Writing extensively in the field of modern art, he published a monograph on Bonnard in 1994. I first encountered Julian Bell's writings upon reading his impressive article on Bonnard in the Times Literary Supplement in 1998, and I confess to quoting him often on the subject of a particular painting in our exhibition. He speaks of young women in the garden as a picture with its own archaeology, a fitting term for a canvas layered with emotional history. Many thanks, Julian, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Dita. What I have to say may well overlap, circle round, and interweave with what you have to say, have just so eloquently said. But I'd like to start with an initial moment of self-consciousness. The museums are full of uprooted pictures, Bonnard once said. The artist was anxious for his pictorial seedlings. They might be thrust out into galleries in which they would struggle for survival among alien life forms, and in which the climate might prove too chill, above all, the light too bleak. In the light of the south of France, he said, everything is sharp and your painting shimmers. Take it to Paris and the blues turn to grey. And therefore, he adds, you can never paint violently enough. You must be violent with your colour. You must heighten the tones in order to counteract this problem of pictures dwindling away in their impact as they are transposed from one place to the other. An exhibition such as the one now in the Lehman Galleries, is surely the best possible posthumous answer to Bonnard's anxieties, replanting a superbly chosen selection of his pictures in the warmth of each other's companionship. And yet, when it comes to a slide lecture, such as this present, I still feel that the issue of uprooting nags. Slide projection truly does uproot. The more or less 2-foot square object that's now hanging downstairs, called Bouquet of Mimosas, an object with a singular, irregular surface that in places is thinly scuffed and stained with the off-white of the canvas primer raw to the eye, and in others is thick, ruckled and bumpy in blobby conglomerations of cadmium yellows and reds. A violently produced object, indeed. This object is rootedly dissimilar to what we are currently looking at, this 12-foot expanse of pure light. The projected image has an inherent glamour that is alien to the awkward, hand-worked original of Bonnard. It beams at us as a self-assured, invulnerable fait accompli, and that makes it harder for us to conceive what it can have been like to be Bonnard, and with what set of interests one could have worked to produce such an object, which is the question I ultimately want to puzzle at, even if I cannot hope satisfactorily to resolve it. I want somehow to keep in mind the distinction between whatever we shall look at in this lecture theatre and the objects downstairs that the artist himself produced. One of the reasons it has often been noted that Bonnard has a lower profile in art history and in the collective memory than his friend Matisse, for all that the two artists evidently respected one another as equals, is that he is so much less of an image maker. He creates extraordinarily absorbing objects to look at, as everyone who goes downstairs can attest, and yet he fails, or is it that he declines, to deliver resoundingly memorable, reproducible, poster-friendly designs. Even at their most majestic, his canvases are relatively elusive. What sits on more sitting room walls? And thus, in most quick-fire accounts of 20th century art history, Matisse ends up looking central and Bonnard peripheral. Now, I personally am drawn to the art of Bonnard even over and against that of his great colleague. And yet, I would argue that this critical predicament is not exactly a mistake or an injustice done to Bonnard, but rather a natural consequence of his whole artistic disposition. To advance that idea, however, and perhaps more interestingly, to try to intuit what went into the painting of Bouquet of Mimosas, I want first to perform further acts of uprooting. My focus will move further and further away from this intricate and vehement object, painted some 3 years before Bonnard's death in 1947, to take a long distance from the work now on show and consider its wider social and biographical context before I head back eventually homewards to Bonnard's studio. Moreover, I feel there's a sense in which everything I say is going to be an uprooting, for the quiddity of such an art is so emphatically resistant to verbalization. Dismissing that quibble. We're looking at some sprays of mimosa stood in a jug on a table under electric light. In Bonnard paintings, we're most often being shown things that Bonnard has seen in the solid actual world, arranged in roughly the configurations in which he happened to observe them. And so it is here. That Provençal half-glazed earthenware jug crops up in other pictures of Bonnard's, while the mimosa sprays have come from the tree in Bonnard's garden that features in the majestic large canvas, also painted during the artist's 70s, now in the Pompidou in Paris. Bonnard would have seen what he painted in this central canvas almost exactly 65 years ago, since this is the season for mimosa blooms. We know because Henri Cartier-Bresson took a photo of him in his dining room in early 1944, in which what seemed pretty certainly to be the self-same sprays of mimosa sit in the self-same jug, albeit in afternoon light. The table they sat on would have been placed nearer the window, since on examination we can just make out the same window catch at the top left there as happens there. This is the typical situation with Bonnard pictures. There are all these anterior facts underpinning almost every mark in the canvas, rather as those canvases themselves underpin the projected images we've been looking at. Cartier-Bresson was photographing a 76-year-old who had been alone for the past 2 years, since Marthe, his companion for most of the previous 50, had died in January 1942. No doubt we can read something of Bonnard's widowerhood into the slightly dishevelled state of his room. In Marthe's day, 12 years earlier, the same room came across like that in Bonnard's art. The room we're looking at was on the ground floor of a 2-story villa, and one of the rooms directly above it also appears very frequently in the pictures now on exhibition. The small upstairs sitting room, ground floor, first floor. Another, the even smaller bathroom next door, generated such a wealth of pictorial material that the paintings based on it can find no place in the present tightly focused selection. Moving around the house during the 20-plus years that he lived there, Bonnard would jot down in a personal draftsman's shorthand little apprehensions of the spaces he inhabited, configurations or visual events that captivated him, with pencil on small slips of paper like the left, or in the pocket diaries that we see some of on display in the show. But to restate one of the fundamental conditions of Bonnard's art, the canvases themselves were not worked on in front of the scenes themselves, nor would they be worked on while the visual event was new and fresh in Bonnard's mind. According to his housekeeper, he would never actually commit to paint flowers, such as those mimosa sprays, till after the blooms themselves had died. Bonnard would remove himself, would pass through an alternative door on the first-floor landing of his compact little mansion, and in doing so, would switch to a different plane of existence from the immediate, the transient, and the factual. Once he was facing the studio wall on which he liked to pin unstretched cuts of canvas, he was dealing with pictures, with tableaux. And to quote a characteristic remark of his, they're always talking of surrendering to nature, you know, the kind of naturalist, impressionist notions of the 19th century. They're always talking of surrendering to nature. There's also surrendering to the picture. The two realms were unalike. Outside of that studio wall lay nature, the observable world, that is, the common 3D space through which all of us move. The tableau, the work of art, the object to which he devoted the best of his time, dabbing and smearing and scuffing at that firmly resistant, granular 2D surface with his oils. All that might have to do with nature, but only obliquely. What sort of obliquely we'll maybe return to. For rather than ascribe too rigid an aesthetic theory to Bonnard, he himself being thoroughly distrustful of pat theorizations, I'd like here to step away a little from the current exhibition with its focus on interiors. What might nature consist of if Bonnard stepped out the door of the Villa du Bosquet? His house still stands, progressive maps there, and I've downloaded a Google Earth image for you of the present-day thing. I think Bonnard might have had great fun with swimming pools, but he had to leave that to David Hockney. But that's a later stage in the evolution of Le Canet. Here he is in his house on the flank of a kind of natural amphitheatre that circles round Le Canet. Le Canet had been a one-time Provençal hill village and is nowadays more or less effectively a suburb of Cannes. Now, when this wiry, well-spoken old boy with the dachshund took his daily walk up the hill overlooking his house, he'd pass locals working in their small holdings, there on the right, and cross over the canal that supplied Cannes with water. If he turned and looked downhill, his gaze would descend from the Esterel Mountains in the distance, through lush palms, yuccas, olives, and eucalyptus, down to the loud red roofs of other Le Canet villas, increasingly punctuated, come the 1940s, by the white of modern concrete apartment blocks. And since Bonnard's death in 1947, the concrete has gained a firmer grip, as you can see from the exhibition photograph of Le Canet. Now, the sentimental allegiances with which Bonnard regarded these vistas are spelt out when he writes to his friend Matisse that he longs to see the land as the peasants up there in their small holdings see it. And when he complains to an interviewer in the late 30s about too many people and too many ugly villa developments in the region. And yet, the landscapes of his last 20 years engage not only with the romance of the Provençal pastoral, but with that ugliness. His heart may be up in the hills with the Provençals tending their plots there on the left, but his feet are planted firmly on the developer's tarmac in this view down the Avenue Victoria. He is, in fact, one of the hundreds of thousands come down from the conurbations of northern France to seek a good life in the sun. And his ambivalent feelings are surely typical of those ex-Parisians and so on. Now, a few of the earliest pictures in the exhibition were done before Bonnard and Marthe bought their house in the south, when they had a country getaway in the Seine Valley. The previous owner of this property in the Seine Valley, quite near to Monet's place, he was friendly with the senior painter, the previous owner had christened his place Maroulotte. It pleased Bonnard to retain that name. My caravan! How piquant to insist that this bourgeois householder was at heart a roving bohemian, just like the bourgeois householder who had lived there before him, just like, no doubt, those living all around him. A comparable mindset sustained not only the municipality of Le Cannet, where most of these pictures were painted, but the whole 100-mile strip of modern development on either side of it. The villas on, well, you can, here are 4 postcards of Le Cannet. Here is 1880s Le Cannet, 1910, 1920, and then 10 years after Bonnard's death. The villas on the Avenue Victoria were part of a massive, burgeoning, what shall we say, pleasure colony, mocktopia, that had only taken off in the late 1880s as Bonnard turned 20. The point, in fact, at which its sales talk epithet, Côte d'Azur, was coined. It was at that point, also, that the landscape gardeners of the new sun-worshippers suburbs decided to jazz up the coastal hillsides of Provence with all the cool blues of their pines and their olives by introducing the brilliant yellow of mimosa, imported from Australia, not to mention palms, eucalyptus, etc. Bonnard's painting, I'm saying, attends to an environment which has been created specifically to cater to homeowners' dreams of getting away from it all, latches onto that environment, makes it its elective home. A perfectly standard destiny, one might say, for a scion of the professional classes, this relocation in middle age to a villa with all mod cons and a goodly-sized garden. Bonnard started as the son of a head of department in the French Ministry of War, and he had been favoured with all the intellectual equipment of a French classical education. Yet from that, this shy but shrewd young man, sketching himself in the late 1880s, was able to leap to the cutting edge of the Parisian avant-garde only 3 or 4 years after he started committing himself to painting. He soon, moreover, started to make a living from it. Success came early, and financial struggles would never be a major issue. The Bonnard of the early 1890s, of his mid-20s that is, could at once be fey and charming and commandingly sophisticated. In a wonderful essay for the exhibition catalogue, Rémy Labrousse explores how Bonnard attuned himself to the complexities of Mallarmé's poetic philosophy. The thought is roughly, crudely put along these lines. Are surface appearances, so atmospheric, so misty, so mazy, so puzzling as they are, all we can ever know of the world? Will its essence forever elude us? Or, alternately, is the appearance, the atmosphere itself, as apprehended and given form by the artist's, the poet's sensibility, none other than that essence itself? This is the kind of utopian dream that Mallarmé's thought turns on. Another pipe dream, carried through from the same heady period, likewise subtly informs the late works in the current show. The early 1890s, like the 1960s, were one of those moments when, to the young, all utopian prospects, no matter how incompatible, seem not only conceivable, but inevitable. Modern art, so thought the avant-garde of the period, for all the interned, recondite, seemingly difficult demeanour of a wriggling painting like this urban fug of tobacco, hashish smoking? I don't know. Somehow, all this wrigglingness must serve life. It must contribute to the greater commonwealth of spiritual good. It could somehow be reconciled with anarchism, or at least with socialism. It must somehow help to humanize humanity. And we may even see traces of these in these deeply private works of Bonnard's later years. But most evidently, the lasting residue of Bonnard's Parisian youth is the working class girl, 10 years his junior, that he picks up in 1893 near the Place de Clichy. Marthe, there she is on the left, in a very intense and expressionistic canvas which he paints at the end of the 1890s, showing their twin naked forms. Marthe becomes, from this period onwards, the somewhat socially awkward presence, shy, slight, fastidious, anxious, socially ill at ease, that he carries along with him as, following the turn of the century, Bonnard moves out from the avant-garde into the exalted circles of haut bourgeois patronage and increasingly of country getaway living. In fact, from his mid-30s, the artist moves away from any real connection with the avant-garde, backwards towards Impressionism, the doctrine his generation had already discarded by the late 1880s. He discovers the appeal of laying down the fresh hues of open landscape on a white ground, in contrast to the deep, urban, tenebrous murk in which we saw the previous two canvases. Charm, touches of arch classicism, a little nod to Mallarmé, fauns from Mallarmé's famous Après-midi d'un faune, hang around this otherwise naturalistically rendered landscape. Oh dear, I've forgotten where it is, but never mind. And then, it's not, I think, the south of France, which is the terrain that Bonnard discovers towards the end of this high-living Belle Époque, first decade of the 20th century, when he motors down south and gets to the Côte d'Azur. In a way, he's moving backwards yet again. Signac and Matisse had already drunk deep from those southern lights many years before him. Renoir had already rented a villa in Le Cannet itself. A couple of years after this, however, in the early 1910s, the painter comes to and experiences an artistic midlife crisis. The clamour of talk about Cubism issuing from Paris around 1910, with its new, challenging and puzzling ethos of intellectual rigour, suddenly makes him feel that he's been wandering, drifting too lazily in a kind of woolly reverie. I think I want to return to the implications of that. For the immediate biographical backdrop to the present exhibition is the emotional midlife crisis that he undergoes a decade later, in his early 50s. A crisis evidenced by this truly expressionistic self-portrait, which reveals what drama may lurk behind the superficial pleasure imagery of Bonnard. I simply bring in the Hilliard miniature from Elizabethan England as a comparative material, not to suggest influence, but one cannot feel that the communication is rather the same. I burn, I am in passion, that is the element in which I live. This furious, strange painting that he keeps hidden away in his studio till after his death. What's happened in this time, about 1921 or so, is that after a long time with Marthe, he's suddenly fallen for a young blonde. And he goes so far, Renée Monchatti, her name, he goes so far, apparently, we don't have the full details in the public domain, as to proposed marriage. This canvas was started sometime around this. Renée is sitting looking up at him with the prospect of luscious fruit behind her. And somewhere, and there's that frequent marker for the presence of the artist himself, his dachshund, on the bottom left. Should be noted, there's one of the anomalous objects in which Bonnard specializes, also above the dachshund. He loves putting in things which no one for the life of them can work out what they are. Provoking habit. We want everything explained, please. And then on the far right, Marthe, looking on. She's about to intervene. She intervenes. She wins the day. Renée is dismissed. Bonnard, in 1925, 32 years after marrying Marthe, after meeting Marthe, at length marries her. And whereupon Renée shoots herself dead. Sensation. How do we read that great trauma into these pictures now on show that are centered on the villa he buys, also in 1925, for Marthe and himself to live in? Is it reasonable to read that trauma in at all? I think at a minimum it's reasonable to infer that behind these images of the intensely familiar and quotidian, a script, something along the lines of, okay, so this is the kind of life, this is the kind of wife I'm committed to, I'd better hunker down and work with them. But then the question comes, work with those conditions in what spirit? This has been one of the turning points for the interpretation of Bonnard's works of his last 20 years, which are generally agreed to be the most remarkable part of his oeuvre. There is one guideline that's applied by his nephew and official interpreter and amanuensis, Charles Terrasse. I think Dieter mentioned this before. Terrasse wrote shortly after Bonnard's death, thinking it an appropriate comment, he wished to paint nothing but happiness. That the Pollyanna, Panglossian implications of that line, needless to say, did Bonnard's reputation immense damage in right-thinking circles of modernist opinion for a long time to come. By reaction, accordingly, much of the criticism that has been concerned to vindicate Bonnard and affirm the interest of his art has dwelt on the only half-suppressed expressionist in him. This line in criticism has liked to quote the remark that Bonnard once committed to his diary, "He who sings is not always happy." In one of the finest of recent books on Bonnard, one I recommend, Timothy Hyman has memorably described some of the late interiors as coded messages from prison. One can adapt the script. Here I sit in that mirror, a melancholy old stoic, cooped up with this possessive, neurotic wife who does nothing but bathe herself all day long. My God! Now, I respect Hyman's work greatly. I would qualify this reading, however, by noting the deep, patent, and affecting tenderness with which he traces the likeness of the woman he sits with every day at breakfast in a painting like this. And I would add furthermore that he who is not happy may yet sing. I would in fact venture that Terrasse's somewhat notorious phrase is pretty literally correct. Painting, as so many of us here must know, is an activity fundamentally disposed towards happiness for whoever participates in it, for all its incidental frustrations, for all its interminable difficulty, the dabbing and smearing and scuffing at that firm and granular surface were Bonnard's palpable joy and are now by proxy our own as his engaged viewers. It all, in a sense, turns on that upper floor landing we looked at in the house plan before. Go through one door and you remain in nature, in the solid shared world, with its interpersonal emotions, with its bills to pay and who knows what else. Pass through an alternative door, and you have migrated to flatland, to the realm of the interesting rectangle, asking to be charged with paint. The only reason you might forget to be happy in such a realm of rewarding and stimulating activity is if you were confusing it with the world of nature, if you were trying to invest it with the status of fact, if you were striving after the pictorially forlorn objective of accurate recording. That, as we can see from the fabric of paint here, and it shows still more clearly if you go and look at the canvas itself, is an impulse that Bonnard has become dedicated thoroughly to counter, even as he paints Marthe's likeness very faithfully and tenderly. He is concerned to knock it back into the matrix of paint from which it arises. It has, if you like, a subordinate level of reality, of solidity to the vibrant teapot and cobalt blue cup in the foreground. It becomes of a continuity with the wall behind. So Bonnard's daily concern as a working painter, happily working away, singing, is how he is to translate, how he is to transmute the data he has gained from his initial, urgently sketched apprehension of nature into a separate, self-contained object. A tableau, a picture, is a little like a book. It must transport its interest to wherever it is taken, Bonnard noted. It must be prepared to suffer uprooting, and hence his reach for strength of colour, for vibrancy of hue. It is in the thoughtfulness with which he invests each part of that rectangle that I see Bonnard as a genuine heir to the 3 centuries-old French tradition that was headed by Poussin. The power of that tradition, its exportability, its worldwide impact, has lain in its singular concentration on pictorial means, on what one easel painting, standing by itself, is able to deliver. Poussin, the original pictor philosophus, painter-philosopher, had to think about packaging off his scrupulously reasoned compositions from his studio in Rome to his patrons in Paris. Bonnard may have been thinking about canvases that he could send to Bernîmes Jeune, and hopefully which would end up in the sympathetic homes of his bourgeois patrons rather than in public museums. Yet the intense concentration of focus stays consistent. One aspect of this concentration on means was the radical approach to drawing that Bonnard increasingly adopted. I mentioned earlier how he was challenged and seemingly shocked awake out of his impressionist leanings, dalliances, by the advent of Cubism in the early 1910s. Was Bonnard able to realign his act to those of Picasso and Braque? I rather doubt he was. Their pictorial language had become altogether too divergent to anything he could relate to. But I rather suspect he was able to draw from an artist who's been slightly written out of the art historical script nowadays, but was a very big cheese in his day, André Derain. Derain's interpretation, circa 1910, of what the Cubist revolution in representation might be all about, was to develop a notion of reverse perspective, a pictorial negotiation between the aspect, what you see of the object from where you stand, and the concept, what you know of the object, which is, in effect, its Platonic form, the idea of the table in the mind of God. Now, what you know of the object is, I just compare the drawing, very beautiful drawing of those objects on the table with the treatment of them by Derain, and I think you'll see what I mean. That the issue, what you know of the object, impinges on Bonnard because, without ever being didactic or theoretical, he is, from his initial interest in Mallarmé onwards, an instinctively philosophical artist. His still lives bear on a thought almost too basic, almost too baby-like to enunciate in elegant language. Hey, I see objects. What are objects? How am I to tell of them? How am I to express the frisson their presence delivers to me? Written into that dumb awe is the sophisticated awareness that the frisson, the sensation, the perception is all he can hope to speak of. Objects, for this painter, are stimuli, and yet there's a naked gusto with which he embraces those stimuli. Dita, in her marvellous catalogue essay, compares Bonnard to Chardin. I don't have a slide of Chardin to show for comparison, but Chardin's still lives make objects well out of a matrix of logical constants, out of space and mass and light. They're kind of objects, real objects in a Newtonian universe. By contrast, that real universe has retreated in Bonnard, and instead we've got an object, this kind of primal wonder. The still lives they remind me most of are of a wonderful Mexican artist of the late 19th century called Hermenegildo Bustos, who painted this delightful little canvas and a whole load of others like it. They came to London about 10 years ago, 15 more. Again, there's this sense of unadulterated delight in the multiplicity of things, in the many objects that there are in the world. Now, in fact, to propose a still life is most often to think about the situation, not only that there are objects, but that there are many of them, many stimuli, and that the mind is able to hold their multiplicity in suspense, overseeing it, scanning it. And then, in the larger, more dramatized version of still life, that is an interior with figures, the contents of a room become a kind of analogue for the mind's contents and the mind's multiplicity, how it is able to reflect this way with the woman sitting on the left, and then alternately that way with the figure he's invented on the right. And then there are many objects, there are many things to think about. This sounds very dumb, but I think it's very, very essential. And there is also, in between them, as in this painting, there's in between them a great deal of not very much. Can a picture be exactly coextensive with an object or with a stimulus? Not really. The object is placed inside a rectangle. A painting like Cherries dramatizes this fact. It's a way of mulling on the pictorial challenge set out by David's Death of Marat. Can one make a picture out of the conjunction between something and nothing, between a clear and palpable focus of attention and an irredeemable blur, investing each with equivalent intensity? Note, particularly if you go to the actual canvas downstairs, the extraordinary but very typical disparity between the two passages of paintwork, well, the two main passages of paintwork in the canvas on the right. The hot, frantic, you could say, sexualized speed with which Bonnard goes at those exciting cherries, and then the protracted, infinitely checked, questioned and then restated worrying over of the nothing much blur above. Now, this handling of the cherries leads us into what increasingly becomes the heart of the matter as Bonnard works on into his old age, the issue of colour. It's notable throughout this later work that in the array of stimuli that Bonnard invests the canvas with, there's really no such thing as far away. This will explain it. There's no such thing as far away, and there's hardly any such thing as dark. There are only different colours living on a surface. We get no such tonal drama to lead us into a far distance as there is in the great paintings of Claude Lorraine, or to project objects into emergence, as in the very beautiful still lives of Fontaine-Latour. So we have these colours on a surface, and tentatively I'd like to sketch in what kind of contrasts in the absence of distance, in the absence of darkness, those colours typically revolve around, and what kind of poetic connotations they carry. I shall stand in danger of allegorizing Bonnard's colour. It's bound to go wrong. It's bound to uproot it too much. But the main contrast, or polarity, as I see it, could almost be reduced to a clash of metals, iron against lead. At one end of his late work, we have the primary instinctual terrain of Bonnard's feeling, the iron oxide, the ochres, the siennas, the Mars reds, the Indian reds, and then coming still closer in, still hotter on his veins of sensation, the fierce cadmium reds, as in those cherries we were just looking at. Working with these colours, it is as if Bonnard is wholly projecting himself into what he paints. It's continuous with his hemoglobin, with the shutting of his eyelids. He is wholly, affirmatively, here. And then, suppose those colours to be the north of his compass. The south is lead white. White, which with hindsight we think of as the colour of 20th century modernity, of absolutists like Mondrian and Malevich. Here carries a connotation of artifice, of the snowfall-like effacement of nature and of sensation and of here-ness. White is an alien absolute that parallels the intrinsic strangeness of flatland, of the pictorial universe that he commits himself to in his work. As, again, Dita notes in her catalogue essay, the tablecloth frequently becomes an analogue, almost a metaphor for the picture itself, this alien space bang in the middle of the picture. And he riddles with these terms, but characteristically, most characteristically, Bonnard's compositions descend from red towards white. Like his senior friend Monet with his water lilies, Bonnard is fond of picture schemes that dangle, setting all the weight, all the immediacy at the top, making a journey down towards that strange south pole of whiteness. Just how much of a picture can be given over to white? The grandest and most radical of all the pictures now on this show, the extraordinary white interior of 1933, or is it 1935, manages to hold together an extravagantly wide clutch, kind of from here to here of what he sees around him. All the very nearest, very warmest, most familiar constituents of his daily life, thrust into a complex perspective, and then pitched, removed, given over into that transmuting, alien chill of flatland, of the tableau of art. In the effort to achieve white, if you like, white keeps shimmering away and shivering away on one side towards the greys, the mauves, through to the violets, the crimsons, the blues, the more absorbent and equivocal receptacles for the eye, easier things to look at. And then, on the other side of white, there increasingly rises up, in Bonnard's late work, the colour that thrusts itself forward and declares itself to be light proper, transcending and yet bridging both the bodily reds and the annulling dazzle of white, the primal colour of the sun. The painting that he started in the 1920s of his tragic relationship is reworked after Mart's death, and he charges it up with this vast load of cadmium yellow, setting the whole of the rest of the imagery, so potent and so emotion-laden, into relief. He's, as it were, transcending that realm. And so, with this final accent on the transcendent, primal, sun-like power of yellow, our God is the sun, is what he says to an artist friend in very late in his life. And so it is that we come back to the yellows of a confected, imported, exotic landscape gardener's dream of a flower, sitting in a tourist trophy, echt ethnic Provençal jug, under the electric light of a dainty retirement villa, crackling with a shattering power in the midst of a leisure park mock paradise. Bonnard's place in the 20th century world is assertively, electively peripheral. He is just one pair of eyes reflecting on a few well-known objects, far from the art scene, the happening scene. Yet he trusts that thereby he will deliver something back, sustaining to the wider commonwealth of human spiritual experience. For, through a concentrated and thoughtful process of packaging and transmuting sensation, he's worked his way back from all those sidelong journeys by which he slipped away from the urban north to the touristy south, from the connubial interchanges of the living room to the solitary singing in the studio. Bonnard's stance and his profile, as I see it, relate to the mainstream of modernist art, to the achievements of Matisse, Picasso, et al., as the low and mazy dormer estates relate to the city centre high-rise office blocks. To understand how the city works, we need to take into account the interdependence of both. In arguing for the value of Bonnard, I appeal to the suburbanite that each of us either is or has it in us to be. I ask us to value and respect that escapist, that private shuffler. I take him for the pictorial philosopher of our inner migrations. Thank you.